Hi guys. Okay, so video for May 4th, 2020. May 4th, also known as Star Wars Day, or May the 4th be with you. Wearing my The Child shirt, and I have my little Star Wars pictures there because I'm a Star Wars weirdo. But good news, this is the last unit we're going to be covering, so this is the last week of new information and the last week of videos. Unit 6 is the last one that the AP exam is going to cover, so it's everything from Units 1 through 6 we've covered over the last quarter that we're going to be going over or expecting to see on the AP exam. So today we're going to cover two. The first one is 6.1, Rationales for Imperialism, and then 6.2, State Expansion. So the context. Our essential question is, what ideologies contributed to the development of imperialism between 1750 and 1900? And if you're a little bit confused about the definition of imperialism, don't worry, we're going to get through it through this whole entire video and presentation. Basically, to kind of answer that question before we even get started is, these countries are going to start competing with each other for natural and raw resources located in places that are underdeveloped. So you're going to have competition amongst industrialized states going to non-industrialized countries to basically steal what they have and then use it for their advantage. And then you also have social Darwinism, which is basically another form of scientific racism that was used to justify this expansion. So let's start with the motives for imperialism. The definition, according to what the text says, I'm trying to look for my mouse so I can move myself, sorry, is the definition for imperialism is the establishment of overseas empires motivated by a belief in nationalism, a desire for economic wealth, a sense of religious duty, and or a belief that Europeans were biologically superior. So when a larger country goes to a smaller country and essentially overtakes it by force, to make it theirs, to steal their resources, to take what they have, and it becomes a colony, or it becomes property essentially of that bigger country. So European nationalism is going to start with Great Britain. Great Britain needed to expand its empire and gain resources after losing the American colonies. So they're going to expand their influence into Australia, South Asia, India, and Southeast Asia as well. France is going to expand its territory in order to increase their prestige, their power, their reputation. They have lost some territory that was really important to them in the Franco-Prussian War. Prussia at the time was kind of like what we might call Germany today. They lost some territory known as Alsace and Lorraine. It's there on the map right above my head, the territory that's in orange. So if you notice where it's at, it borders between France and Germany. And so they did fight over this, not specifically this piece of land, but they did fight a war with each other, and then France ended up losing and had to give up this territory. So they are looking to expand to kind of regain face or make up for their losses. So they are going to expand into Algeria in North Africa, into the islands in the South Pacific, Senegal in West Africa, Indochina in Southeast Asia, which is like Myanmar, Burma, Thailand, and Peninsular Malaysia, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. So lots of territories, lots of small little islands clustered together. Italy and Germany were these newly united nations, and they wanted to gain prestige and economic power as well. So they wanted to prove that they were just as powerful or as wealthy or had enough military strength as these other bigger, larger industrialized countries as well. Spain, despite being a dominating colonization power in the early 16th century, they're not going to take part in this second wave of industrialization. They are dealing with their own problems at home, and so they're not going to participate. So let's see, sorry. Okay. Japanese imperialism was a little bit different. We kind of did mention this briefly before, so I'm not going to go super into detail, but it was a sense of national pride that caused them to kind of defend themselves going into Korea. So that was their rationale for going into another country. This happened to upset China because China had already had influence on Korea for many, many, many centuries. It's going to result in the Sino-Japanese War. Japan is going to end up winning this war. Not only will they gain access to Korea, but they will also gain access to Taiwan, and they're going to weaken China. So this political cartoon, I actually showed it to you in class. It actually shows the Qing Emperor trying to halt or stop what looks and appears to be the division of his country. So you can see representatives from different places, England, Russia, sorry, I forgot for a second, Germany, the French Marianne, and Japan all trying to divide up pieces of China, and then eventually they'll get into the spheres of influence when we get to it, and we talked about it later. Sorry. There you go. Okay, so then racial ideologies. Okay, this kind of goes into the ties of the pseudoscience, social Darwinism ideas. Pseudoscience is a collection of beliefs or practices mistakenly regarded as being based on scientific method, aka fake science. Colonial powers believed that they were inherently superior to others, which means they felt like they were born biologically superior or above other people. Phrenologists are scientists who study skull sizes, and so they did these really, I guess you can call them antiquated or outdated studies of a human skull or different skulls from different races and different ethnicities, and they believed that the white skulls were larger and the non-white skulls were smaller, which meant that the brain size was equivalent to skull size, which is not true. So they believed that because non-whites had smaller skulls, they had smaller brains, and therefore this proved that they were more mentally feeble, which included Africans, Indigenous Americans, and Asians as well. Basically, they were using that as a way to justify that they were smarter and they were biologically superior to other races. This is not factual. The people have proved this wrong. It's going to lead to a social theory called social Darwinism. So Darwinism comes from Charles Darwin's theories about natural selection. You guys have probably heard the term survival of the fittest, even though Darwin himself didn't invent that. He got it from somebody else, but he's famous or famously associated with it. Social Darwinism is the idea that the people who are in charge because they're supposed to be in charge. They have overcome obstacles to be the strongest, to be the fittest, to be the ones who are supposed to be the chosen ones, essentially, if you will. And so this idea is going to spread to the United States, it's going to spread to Europe, and these people are going to grow with the idea that they are superior because that is the way it's supposed to be. And you're going to see that idea manipulated pretty much from this point on for the rest of history. Those of us who were able to go to Washington and you guys went to the Holocaust Museum, you saw a whole entire wall dedicated to this version of pseudoscience when people believe that they were biologically superior to other people, which is not true. Okay. So some cultural and religious ideologies. The culture imperialists, believed that they were culturally superior. Everybody else was regarded as a barbarian or a savage because the only way to be was the European way. So they combined a lot of local cultures into one colony and they threw kind of everybody together, which created this like one weird blended version of syncretic identity. They introduced their language, their political, their religious, and their educational institutions in these colonized areas, and they would continue to exert their cultural influence on architecture and recreation as well. So I put a picture there of an American Indian who has been educated or assimilated into the European style because this is what is supposed to happen. You're supposed to give up your old ways and assimilate or blend in with the new ways. Religion. Missionaries moved into these imperialized areas and they were criticized for encouraging natives to give up their traditional beliefs in favor of Christianity, which left these countries open to economic imperialism, which we'll talk about on the next slide. There were some negatives and there were some positives. The picture that you shows there basically, or at the bottom, has a Christian missionary who is kind of forcing the natives to convert to Christianity. And then you can see him surrounded by soldiers. So a lot of it was done by force. And so that's not really the godly way if you think about it. A person should have the ability to choose the religion that they want to. The whole point of having religion on the basis of something is free will, that you have the ability to make that choice for yourself. And this was a forced conversion for many, many people. There were some positives that the missionaries did bring with them. One of them was that they were able to set up schools for people living in these areas. They were able to improve medicine, and they did, or many of them did, fight to end slavery and end the slave trade in these regions. Okay, so some economic motivations for imperialism and the new imperialism. Ideological motivations were used to justify economic imperialism. Europeans first established trading posts through the treaties with local India, East Africa, and the East India rulers. Some companies had already moved into the region for the spice trade, and some had government powers, which included the ability to command armies as well as conquer territory without permission of their king necessarily. And industrialization sped up this search for resources, creating competition between imperial powers because it's not enough just to discover a land, but you have to be the first one there, because if not, somebody else is going to beat you to it and they're going to take all the good stuff. Then you have what's known as new imperialism. Great Britain was the first major imperialistic power. Colonies gave raw goods to be worked in factories, which provided new markets for finished goods and for food. In the second industrial revolution, though, things are going to change. Other nations are going to begin looking to create industrial empires as well. So the picture that you actually have there is supposed to be a political cartoon representing the Spanish monarchy, holding down several Latin American countries in the corner because they're trying to scramble for any territory that's left that Great Britain has already claimed for themselves. Okay. So trading companies. The British East India Trading Company, or also known as the EIC, sometimes in my next couple of slides I'm going to just put EIC, but when I say it or when I speak it, I'll call it the British East India Trading Company. They monopolized British trade with India beginning in the 1600s, which began with cotton, silk, and spices. They expanded into East Asia. By 1834, they were the managing agency in India, and then we know at some point they're eventually going to take over the entire country. They did engage in slave trade, and they will begin to export opium to China illegally. I'll go further into that later, but remember, opium is a drug, and it is illegal, so they're going to engage in some criminal activity. The Dutch East India Trading Company is nicknamed the VOC. That is because in their language, that's what the company is called. I'm not going to pretend to pronounce it, and I won't try and sound fancy, but it's just different. So there's a British trading company and there's a Dutch trading company. The Dutch is the VOC, and you can actually see their symbols up there on the top. The Dutch are going to monopolize trade between South Africa and the Straits of Magellan in South America. So on the map that's also located there, you can see the Straits of Magellan, which they basically go pretty much all the way through South America. The Dutch are going to concentrate around the islands located near Java. And at one point, the government is actually going to have to intervene and take control of this joint stock company because it's going to be very, very corrupt. They're going to have a huge amount of debt, and the government themselves are going to have to step in and handle the management because the Dutch let it go to ruins, essentially. Okay, 6.2, state expansion. So by what process did state power shift in various parts of the world between 1750 and 1900? You're going to see the power shift, especially moving away from monarchies, which means the kings and the queens are not necessarily going to be in charge, but it's going to be more like privatized companies, like joint stock companies, like the East India Trading Company, like the Dutch East India Trading Company, who have monopolies in areas like India, Africa, South America. Over time, though, it's going to switch again because the states are going to have to take control of these companies. Private businesses are not going to have the resources, they're not going to have the management tools to be able to control them for long periods of time. And then you're also going to have industrialized countries having a huge advantage over these non-industrialized nations. It's going to be very, very dangerous for them. So the picture that you actually see here is another political cartoon. I like political cartoons. It actually shows a version of Uncle Sam, which represents America, teaching these savage children, if you will. The American children, the white children are in the back. You have the Indian in the corner, and then you have the children from Latin American countries that we have conquered, or the United States has conquered, right up in the front, getting that extra instruction on how to be American and things like that. And then you have the African over there in the back who's cleaning the window, who isn't really even allowed to go to school at the time because he's not considered a person. So there's a lot of messages in this one political cartoon. Imperialism in Africa. Since European nations had a long-standing relationship with Africa due to the slave trade, the connections and the relationships that were built there were not necessarily positive ones, obviously. Even after slavery was made illegal, Europe continued to export guns, alcohol, and manufactured goods to Africa. They continued to import palm oil, gold, ivory, and diamonds from Africa. So all valuable natural resources. You do have a move and a shift from trading posts. So the discovery of medicines like quinine, which is a malaria drug. Malaria is a particularly nasty disease, or actually I think it's a virus. I'm not 100% sure. But even quinine doesn't cure it, it just treats it. So it helps treat the symptoms of it. It helped reduce the dangers of Europeans living in Africa. You also had the advanced military technology, which made it easier to take or overtake lots of these African nations because they did not have guns. And then you also have the British control of Egypt. So Great Britain is going to seize control of Egypt from the Ottoman Empire. Remember, the Ottoman Empire gets nicknamed the sick man of Europe because they were already so weakened by weak leaders and they were falling apart. And so eventually they're going to gain control of Egypt, really and truly because they wanted to ensure the construction of what becomes known as the Suez Canal. It used to take them a really, really long time because in order for them to sail, they would have to set sail from west to east and then have to literally go all the way around Africa. The Suez Canal cuts that route tremendously because if you look at it, the first map shows you the original route, the one that goes all the way around. The Suez Canal directly connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. So canals are man-made. This is something that was done through lots and lots and lots of hard labor, and it was a very long-term consuming process that was overtaken or undertaken by at least 1.5 million Egyptian workers that were forced to do this through what they called corvée labor, which is essentially like serfdom or indentured servitude, if you will. And they would construct this small piece that would eventually, again, connect the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. Thousands of people died doing this, but it made it easier for Great Britain to trade. Okay, so more imperialism in Africa. The British in West Africa. Great Britain are going to spread education, Western education, I don't know why it's repeated, it should just be Western education, Western education, religion, and Christianity, which is the same thing. I apologize. But at least you know I make my own slides, because then I make a mistake. So you have Sierra Leone. In 1787, Sierra Leone becomes a home for former slaves from the British Empire. You have Gambia, which becomes a place for slaves to stop and rest up or get resources. It's like a home base, if you will. You have Lagos, which is the base for annexation of Nigeria. And eventually some of these people tried to use treaties first. A lot of these countries tried to use treaties with local leaders. Obviously, most of them were unsuccessful because once the European countries realized that they were much more technologically and industrially advanced than these smaller tribes, they took over very, very, very quickly. As you can tell from the map, everything that's in color belongs to a European country. You have the red French, you have the blue British, you have the purple Spanish, you have the yellow Portuguese, you have the dark blue Belgium, you have the green Germany, you have the tannish color Italy, and then you have the only two white parts on the country, which on the west coast and on the east coast happens to be Liberia, and we call it today Ethiopia, but I think at the time it was called Abyssinia. That was it. Those only two white territories, that is the only territory in all of Africa that's actually controlled by Africans, which is insane. So it will be an entire scramble for Africa. The French in Africa will drive out the Ottomans of Algeria, which is in northern Africa, in 1830. It's going to become a settler colony for lots of immigrants from Spain, Italy, and France. And the part that has a lot to do with that is that it's in the north part of Africa. And if you're on the most southern tip of Spain and Portugal, you could probably see North Africa. So it's very, very, very close. They're going to establish trading posts in Guinea, the Ivory Coast, and Niger to compete with British West African countries. Okay, so the scramble for Africa, which I kind of already talked about. It's competing efforts of Europeans to colonize Africa in search of natural resources, stealing their goods and taking it back to Britain or wherever it is they're from, and then manufacturing them in factories and then reselling it to them for extremely, extremely high prices. So you have the Berlin Conference, which was an idea of Germany's Otto von Bismarck, which can be seen there in the political cartoon. Bismarck wanted to keep peace in Europe. Sure. So he hosted the Berlin Conference in 1884. He wanted to create an orderly colonization of Africa. The thing was, not a single African was invited to the table. So it was all European powers, and they basically got to decide where the lines went. The problem with that is that this arrangement made colonial boundaries. So, okay, French gets this, Great Britain gets this, Spain gets this, blah, 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 so on and so forth. They never took into consideration the existing tribal boundaries that had existed for centuries. So they went and drew their own lines, and they didn't care that you have a warring tribe next to a neighboring tribe and they don't get along. Let's just put them all together. Or vice versa. You have a tribe that has lived together for thousands of years. Let's divide them right in the middle. They didn't take any of those things into consideration because, again, no Africans were invited to this conference. They did what was best for them and what was best for them only. Liberia and Ethiopia, yes, it was called Abyssinia, were the only unclaimed African countries by 1900, like I told you on that map. The only white two territories, or the territories that were white on the map, ironically, that were controlled by Africans. Liberia had a relationship with the United States because it became a home for freed slaves. So slaves that had previously been taken during the Atlantic slave trade movement made their way back home to Liberia on the West African coast. Then you have the Boer Wars in South Africa. When the Dutch first colonized South Africa, before being pushed out by the British, they had control of large pieces of South Africa. They call themselves Afrikaners. They're Dutch descendants. Some of them have been there more than 300 years. They're going to clash not only with the natives, but they're also going to clash with the British over land. And it's going to lead to brutal conflict. It's going to lead to the British pushing the natives and the Afrikaners, even though the Dutch are white, it's going to push them all out from their lands, forcing many of them into concentration camps. Now, the picture that you see there is a picture. So that means photographs exist. That means newspapers exist. So what's going to happen is that people are going to see photographs of white people living in concentration camps, and then they will be angered and upset by this because, oh my God, Europeans are living in concentration camps. This can't be happening. Nobody bothered to really care that 15,000 out of 100,000 of the black people interned in those same concentration camps also died. They were more concerned for the white Europeans. Eventually, the British are going to absorb southern Africa into their empire. Millions of Afrikaners and black African farmers are going to be forced onto very bad farming land, which makes it very difficult for them because if you have bad farmland, you're never going to have a good harvest. You're not going to be able to provide for your family. So the Dutch and the natives of South Africa are going to lose to the British. In the Congo, move myself one more time. Go back. Okay. So King Leopold, which we talked about, he wanted Belgium to colonize Africa. The problem is that his country did not want to colonize, so he ended up using his own personal money to invade and colonize the Congo. He made an estimated $1.1 billion in what would be today's money, so that's a lot of money. He harvested ivory and he harvested rubber. The conditions were horrendous. They were brutal. People were beaten. People were, jailed, or scared into submission. The workers, the slaves, and their spouses were held captive. So in order to keep people from running away, what he used to do was that he would send the men off to work, and then he would keep the spouses and the children as hostages. As many as 8 million Africans died during King Leopold's reign. And in 1907, it became so bad that Belgium eventually, the country itself, had to take over control of the Congo as a colony, and the conditions improved because they realized that he was a tyrant, and he was crazy, and he was cruel. The picture that you guys see there is King Leopold in the middle, and the other one shows African people who have been disfigured, because one of his favorite things to do was also to disfigure people as a form of punishment, because then they would have to forever live with that disfigurement as a reminder of their disloyalty or disobedience if they did not meet their quota or they did not do something that was asked of them, which was, again, horrendous. Okay, so imperialism in Asia. Move myself again. Diet Coke break. My throat gets dry. So South Asia, which means India. You have Portugal, France, and England competing for Indian spices, gems, and Eastern trade. Portugal established trading posts in the 16th century but never moved inland. France established ports in the 17th century, but they were pushed out of India in the 7 Years' War by Great Britain. So that you're going to have the British East India Company encroaching on land of the Mughal Empire. They slowly gained control of the entire Indian continent by using sepoys. Sepoys are Indian officers or Indian soldiers, but they are under the British control. Kind of like Janissaries in the Ottoman Empire, kind of, but not 100% like that. Then you have East Asia. In the late 19th century and the early 20th century, there's lots of typos in this slide. Man, I must have been half asleep when I was making it. I apologize. But I'll go and fix all the typos when I upload the slides up there for you. In the late 19th century and the early 20th century, China was weakened by the Taiping Rebellion, the Yellow River Rebellion, not a rebellion, the Yellow River changed course, and the Boxer Rebellion. So let me kind of explain those three things. The Taiping Rebellion was, and you have to go back a little bit. When China was conquered, it was conquered by the Yuan, which is the Mongols. Then it went back to the Ming, which are the ethnic Chinese, and then it goes back to the Qing, or to the different empire, which is the Qing, which are also foreigners, are from Manchuria. So you have foreign, ethnic Chinese, and then foreign. At this time, the Qing are in charge, so they are foreigners. The Taiping Rebellion is going to be a rebellion against the Qing Empire, a push to get them out and a push to bring back the natural ethnic Chinese people. The Yellow River is also going to change course during this time. So if you remember the Yellow River, it goes back to the Huang He, one of the earliest river valley civilizations in the area. It changes course, so literally it like flips. It's been flowing for one way, and then all of a sudden starts to flow another way, which is extremely damaging to the people, because if you expect a river to flow one way and you build your homes and you build your businesses and you build your farms for the water to run a certain way, and then it changes course, it is going to have long-term environmental effects. It's going to cause a drought, it's going to cause a famine, 20 million people are going to die. So it was very, very dangerous for them at the time. Then you have the Boxer Rebellion, which we did briefly talk about with the Emperor Cixi. The Boxer Rebellion was used or named to make fun of the Chinese at the time because, remember, they were supposed to be great martial artists. It was an attempt to kick the foreigners out of China, but they failed. All of these things are going to allow China to become weakened and eventually European powers to become very, very powerful and carve out these spheres of influence in China. They're going to have exclusive trading rights with China in their region. So if you look at what makes up South Asia and East Asia at the time, in the red on the map is what belonged to Great Britain. In the green is what belonged to France. In the orange is what belonged to the Netherlands. In the purple is what belonged to Portugal, so only a small territory. In the yellow, it's the United States, which is like the Philippines. In the tannish color, Japan. And then in the pinkish color, it's going to be independent. That's very, very small compared to the large empire that it once was. So, imperialism in Asia, getting to Japan and the colonization society. When I talked about Japan earlier, I talked about them industrializing out of fear because they wanted to defend themselves. They didn't want the same thing to happen to China what happened to them, which is true. So they industrialized and they wanted natural resources from the colonies that they conquered and the colonies that they took over. They were usually, or for most history, they had been an isolated nation. They were very, very closed off. And the thing was is that they had little farmable land. So all of their resources they had to take from other places. And also to relieve some population pressure, they encouraged workers to work seasonally or part-time, if you will, in Hawaii and Guam and other places because they just couldn't support the entire population. So the picture that you guys see there is a political cartoon of a Japanese soldier kind of hoarding all of these other countries because they want to take their resources. Then you have what's known as a colonization society. This was tried to form in 1893, where they tried to colonize Mexico and Latin America to create ports in China, Korea, and Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. This would last all the way from 1890 until the end of World War II. It would not be successful though. Okay, so imperialism in Southeast Asia. You have the Dutch in Southeast Asia. The VOC, the Dutch East India Trading Company, took control of the Spice Islands from the Portuguese. They set up a lot of trading posts, but it was very, very corrupt. Remember I told you guys you just pay them under the table and you don't have to pay the government directly, so there was corruption, some shadiness going on. After the VOC ended up going bankrupt, again, because they didn't manage their funds well, the Dutch government has to come in, step in, take control of the Dutch East Indies. They're going to produce tea, rubber, sugar for export, all of those major cash crops. They limited local rice production, creating a hardship for Indonesian farmers. They took all the good land away from the Indonesian people and only allowed them to make these cash crops because there was a demand for them. And so it limits their food supply. The government will try and pass reforms to get this changed, but they will not be successful. They will fail. And it's going to mean economic and nutritional hardship for these people because they can't farm food for themselves. The French in Southeast Asia, they took control of Vietnam after defeating China in the Sino-French War. They are also going to take control of Cambodia and Laos from Siam, and then which we know as Thailand today. And then all of the French holdings came to be known as French Indochina. They also imperialized for cash crops. They're going to cultivate rubber in Cambodia and Vietnam, which again also hurts local food agriculture. They take all the good land to make cash crops, and they don't have enough land to make food for their people. Okay, so then we get to imperialism in Southeast Asia. The British in Southeast Asia, the British East India Trading Company is going to move into Southeast Asia by getting Penang, which is an island off the Malay Peninsula, in 1786. They were interested in mineral wealth like tin and gold, obviously. They're going to also encourage the production of pepper, tobacco, palm oil, and rubber in the region. Malaya is going to become the world's biggest rubber producer. It's going to actually overtake other places in the entire country and continent in being the number one producer of rubber. Why is rubber so important? Remember industrialization, you need rubber for all the machines, all the factories, all the stuff being built, being made. It's necessary. In 1825, Great Britain founded the port of Singapore, and eventually it's going to become the most important port in Southeast Asia. All the goods are going to come and dock at this one area. So what's going to end up happening is that Great Britain will eventually control all of the Malay Peninsula. Oh, Great Britain. Okay. American imperialism in Latin America, which is something you don't hear about very much. You have the removal of the indigenous people. The U.S. continued its tradition of taking land from native populations, and this is after their independence from Europe. So this is now just the American colonies taking land away from the Native American population that was already here even before Columbus discovered these territories. So you have the forced relocation of eastern woodland people from the southeastern United States to Indian Territory in Oklahoma. In 8th grade, you guys learned about it. Many of them died from malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion. This becomes known as the Trail of Tears. Some of it goes back to the idea behind the Monroe Doctrine. Sorry. They're same ideas but different concepts. So the Monroe Doctrine was created in 1823 by President Monroe, which said that Europe should not get involved in Western Hemisphere affairs. That was because the United States did not want Europe colonizing any more territory in the Americas whatsoever, because they wanted to do it for themselves. The U.S. wanted to be the major power in the Americas, so they're going to try and push and expand westward, because if you remember the 13 colonies, it was just pretty much everything on the East Coast, and they want to continue to push and spread their influence west all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So, for example, you have the Mexican-American War. They took huge amounts of land in the southwest from Mexico, which is Texas today. I'm trying to change the next slide. You also have an expansion of land, which was a belief in manifest destiny. That's what I was getting at. The belief that the United States and settlers were destined to expand all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So they bought Alaska from Russia in 1867. In 1869, they they completed the Transcontinental Railway, which encouraged the development of the American West, and the natives were forced on these reservations. You also have expansion of some territory overseas. Because of economic considerations and the Second Industrial Revolution, nationalism is going to drive the United States to imperialize overseas. At first, this was an idea that was fought against. They didn't want us to have territory anywhere else, but then it's going to be something that's pushed. So in 1895, they're going to actually overthrow Hawaii's constitutional monarchy and claim and have Hawaii for itself. In 1898, you're going to have the Spanish-American War, which gives the U.S. several territories: Guam, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. In 1904, you're going to have an addition added to the Monroe Doctrine. This addition was added by Theodore Roosevelt, who happened to also kind of be a social Darwinist. It was called the Roosevelt Corollary, which basically said that any Latin American country that showed instability would be inverted on by the United States. So if you were a Latin American country and you showed weakness, guess what? The U.S. is coming to take over. And they did that in places like the Caribbean and the Dominican Republic. Whoops. So, lastly, some outcomes of imperialism. You also have Russia expanding. So Catherine the Great expanded Russia in all directions during her rule and annexed half of Poland and territory from the Ottoman Empire. Her grandson, Alexander I, is going to annex territories like Finland, Moldova, Georgia, Azerbaijan, as well as part of Armenia during his reign. So Russia is going to add huge amounts of territory to its kingdom. In the 1740s, a Russian merchant actually traveled to Alaska. They're going to discover the resources that are there. They created a joint stock company that was called the Russian American Company. It was established and headquartered there in Alaska. They're going to explore some of the West Coast, but eventually they're going to abandon North America and go back to Russia. They do have a rivalry with Great Britain, especially as Great Britain continued to push into Central Asia. It becomes a game to them, a game and a fight for territory, pretty much. Think of like when you play Risk or something like that, or Catan, the other game where you fight for territory on a board. They were doing it, except they were doing it with real life people and real life armies. So the Great Game, man, there's lots of typos, I apologize, was the struggle for Afghanistan. Both were very, very unsuccessful. And they're going to take land from China, including large parts of Manchuria. Then you have Australia and New Zealand. Great Britain sent prisoners to Australia. Australia at the time was a penal colony where they would send prisoners there in 1788, but eventually they're going to switch to the production of goods like wool in the 1830s. Settlers began moving to Australia and were encouraged by the discovery of copper and gold in the 1850s. There is going to be a gold rush in Australia, and they're going to create settler colonies in New Zealand, places for people to settle and make new lives for themselves. They had promised to protect the people, the Maori people, in the Treaty of Waitangi, but there were many clashes anyway, and we'll get into that later, I want to say, in tomorrow's notes. So, this is just a picture of the penal colonies at the time. The British were not the only ones that did this. They were not the only ones that had these countries or places where they sent convicts. The British did it, the French did it, the Portuguese did it, and the Spaniards did it as well. But the British obviously have way more than any other territory. Lastly, you have comparing three types of imperialism. So you have three different types. You have the state-run colony, you have the settler colony, and then you have economic domination. I'm going to leave that there for you. It basically breaks it down by everything that we talked about. Your exit ticket, guys, is just to catch up on any missing work. Make sure you turn in your DBQs. Make sure you're checking PowerSchool. Make sure you're keeping up with your grades because it's winding down. We have like a month left or maybe less than that of school. And then also, it is the beginning of Teacher Appreciation Week. So please, if you have time, thank a teacher, email a teacher, send a text, send a short video, or take a picture of yourself with, a poster that says thank you to your favorite teacher. And just, just reach out if you want to, if you need to. And I hope you guys have a good Monday. May the force be with you.